Hi, boys and girls. Today we're going to learn about something in social studies that is called the growth of the English colonies. Now, that probably sounds a little bit boring, but just you wait and see what happens here. Because what we're going to learn today is going to lead into how we became our own country. Because at the time that we're talking about, which is colonial times, what we now call the United States was not called the United States. It was considered a part of England. We were an English colony. And that is a confusing situation for lots of kids to understand. So let's get started and we'll learn about that. And this flag, I'll talk about at the end. Whose flag is that? Because that's not an American flag. That's not a British flag. That's a different flag. So keep that in your brain while we go through this. Okay, so first I want to start with what's a colony. And we already talked about this a little bit earlier, but a colony is like a piece of land that is settled by people who come from a different country. It's different than an immigrant. An immigrant comes from one country to another country and they settle there, but there are already people living there. In a colony, people from one country move to a different place that is considered unsettled and they build a new life for themselves. And this is important that in a colony, it's usually far away from wherever the people are from. And the people who live there, they don't think about themselves. They still think of themselves as citizens of the country they came from. But they're just moving somewhere else in the name of their own country to start a new settlement. So that's what a colony is. And there were, in the time that we're talking about, which is from 1609 until the 1750s, there were colonies in what we now call the United States. They were not all unified and all together. There were just all these different little colonies. And most of the people came from England. The very first colony that was set up in the New World by English people was this colony, which is called Jamestown. And that was in Virginia, and it was built in 1609. It was very small, and it was only mostly men, and they came because they wanted to get a better life and they wanted to make some money. So that was happening in Virginia. And then we learned a few years later, in 1620, the Pilgrims came and they set up their colony in Massachusetts. They're the first English people to settle in Massachusetts, and they called their colony Plymouth Plantation. After that, the Puritans came, and the Puritans settled in their colony in 1630. Their first city was Salem, but then they established Boston. And so there were three colonies that were started up in the 1630s. But in the next few years, thousands and thousands and thousands of people move to what we now call the New World. Most of them come from England. They come to the New World because some of them want religious freedom. They want to worship the way they want to worship. But many come because they want a chance to have a better life. And they could have land and they could have farms. And there were lots of good natural resources that allowed people to survive. So this map shows what are called the 13 colonies. These were the original colonies that were established mostly by English people between 1609 and the time that we're going to talk about. And these are called the 13 colonies. Now, in third grade, we only really focus on Massachusetts, which is way up here. We only focus on Massachusetts, but these other colonies had English people living in them as well. So what's important to understand is the people that lived in this map that we're talking about here, at the time we're talking about, which is the 1600s and the 1700s, they did not call themselves Americans. They didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as English people who happened to live in a new place called the New World, or it's actually they call it their colonies. They did not call themselves Americans, and they didn't use the name America. They were English colonists. They were English people who happened to live in a different place. And I mentioned this already, but not all of the colonies were English. There were some that were established by the Dutch and some by some people from Germany, but most of the land was considered owned by the English king. So the king of England considered himself the owner of the land, and he allowed people to live there. So this is actually King George the Third, and that's from the musical Hamilton. So kids often ask, and I'm always glad when they do, well, what happened to the Native Americans? Because the United States, well, what we now call the United States, at that time had people living there, and we call them Native Americans. They're sometimes called Indians, but that's not considered polite. And the Native Americans were living here when these European and English people came to set up their colonies, and many of them got pushed out of their land. And it was land that they had lived in for thousands and thousands of years, and suddenly these newcomers came in and pushed them out of the land that they lived in. So you could understand that many of them were angry that their land was taken away, and wars started to happen between the Native Americans and the colonists who came in and settled in their land. And there were wars on and off for many years. But ultimately, in the end, the colonists took over much of the land. They had better weapons. There were more of them. And they took over the land, and they forced the Native Americans to leave where they had always lived. So you can imagine that many Native Americans were not very happy with the colonists. But that is what happened in our history. So the King of England owned a lot of the land. And this map, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry. I don't know what happened here, but do you see what this red stripe is? This is those 13 English colonies that I showed you before. This map shows that England, which is also called Britain, that can be a little confusing. England and Britain, English and British, they're all the same thing. They owned this, what is red here. So this is up in Canada, and they owned this. And again, they said they owned it. Native Americans said, we own this, but they came in, they were more powerful, they took over. This blue part, the King of France and French soldiers did the same thing. They came over and they settled, and they claimed all of this land in blue, and they said, this is ours. Now, they didn't have as many people living there. They didn't have as many towns. They had soldiers mostly in forts, where the English right here had whole communities with, cities and towns and farms and jobs and lots of people. This was mostly wilderness with some soldiers and forts. And then Spain owned or took over all of this part of the United States at this time. So those three countries, they're all from Europe, England, Spain, and France, came over to the New World that we now call the United States, and they each kind of divided it up and said, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. This green says unexplored. That means at the time that we're talking about, which is colonial America, people hadn't explored that. There were Native Americans living there, but Europeans hadn't gone up there. So this was kind of confusing because we think of the United States as America, and at this time it wasn't America, and we think it's British, that we're all English, but in reality, these three countries sort of split up the United States in the 1600s. So the question I put at the top is, well, did they all get along and did they share? And the answer to that is no. These three countries at this time in history were often mad at each other, and they were in lots of wars. Some of them were fought in Europe, and lots of the wars were fought here, where one group of British soldiers might attack some French soldiers. And for a long time, these three countries argued over the land. So this map shows, okay, so here's the English colonies, the 13 original colonies, and this is that strip of French land that we talked about, and then this is that other piece of British land. This was red on the other map. Well, can you see this striped piece? This was the land they were fighting over. The British said this is ours, the French said this is ours, and they were having all kinds of battles in here for a couple of years. And this war started, and the war started in the year 1756, and it was called the French and Indian War. And that's a very confusing name because that makes you think that the French and the Native Americans which is called the Indians in this title, fought each other. But that's not what happened. The French came in and they got a lot of the Native Americans who were angry at the colonists for pushing them off their land. And they said, join us, fight with us, the French, who they're in blue in here, fight with us against these colonists. And when this war is over, we'll push them out and you can have your land back. So many Native Americans fought with the French. So on one side of this war were French soldiers and Native American troops that were friendly with it, that allied with that joined with the French, and on the other side were the colonists. They were fighting over the land. The colonists were not doing so well. So let me show you on the next slide. So at first, the French soldiers and the Native Americans were very successful against the colonists. But then the colonists needed help, and they weren't doing so well. So they called on their king, because remember, they think of themselves as English people. So they basically said, King, we need some help. And King George, who was their king at the time, sent his soldiers all the way over from England. He sent them to the colonies, and he told his soldiers, you're going to join up with my colonists. The British soldiers and the colonists are going to fight together against the French soldiers and the Native Americans who joined them. So these huge battles started to break out all over the colonies between these two groups. And this is a picture of a very famous person. That is George Washington. It's a painting of George Washington. George Washington was a young man, and he was a soldier. He fought in the French and Indian War, and he learned from the British soldiers who came over. He learned how to be a really good leader and a really good general. So this is a kind of famous picture of George Washington when he was a young man. And he learned how to become a leader by fighting with the English during the French and Indian War. So that war happened. It started in 1756 and it ended in 1763. King George sends over his soldiers. So these are his soldiers. You can kind of see, let me flip back. Here's George Washington. I mean, he's got a nice little uniform and he's got his musket. But the soldiers that King George sent over at this time, the English Army and Navy, they were the best prepared fighting force probably in the world. They had better ammunition, they had better training, they had more of them. So King George sends over all of these professional soldiers. They join up with the colonists, and together they defeat the French and the Native Americans. So after that war ends, which was in 1763, this is what the map looks like. This red is the original 13 colonies. So these were the British colonies. This pink was French, but after the French and Indian War, all of this land, the French lose. They have to leave, and England takes over all of this. So all of this pink now becomes a part of England's territory. And this red, which they already own, well, kind of owned, this all becomes English territory. And the Spanish are still over here. There's a couple of pockets of French territories down here. But for the most part, all of this land now becomes part of Britain, England. So this was a huge win for the English. And sadly, the Native Americans still didn't get much out of this. They, if they fought with the French, they did not get treated well by the colonists and the British afterward. And so that's like another sad thing that happens to the Native Americans, is that after this war, they're kind of even in worse shape. They have less land and less people, and it's kind of sad. So after that war, the British and the French signed this agreement. And the colonists asked King George, they say, would you please leave some soldiers behind? Because we're afraid that we're going to get attacked, that the French will come back or the Native Americans will come back and we're not as well prepared. So King George is like, yes, you are my people. Because remember, the people did not think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as English colonists. So King George says, sure, I'll leave behind some soldiers. So some of the soldiers return home, but others stay behind. And they're left behind, and many of them live in forts kind of out in the wilderness, that in what used to be French territory, but some of them live in the cities in Massachusetts, some of them live in Boston, and they are left behind, and their purpose is to protect the colonists in case there are future attacks. So just keep that in mind, because that's going to be a part of what happens with this thing called the American Revolution. So that's actually what we study next. I just talked about the French and Indian War, so you can kind of understand what was going on. This is one of the causes of the war, of the American Revolution. Because the American Revolution, which is also called the Revolutionary War, or sometimes it's just called the Revolution, or it could be called the War for Independence, all of that is the same thing, is a war that happened between the British soldiers and the American colonists. So that's a little surprising, because these two groups, the British soldiers and the English colonists, just fought a war together. But in a few years, like 5 years later, they actually end up, it's actually, I think, 10 years later, they end up fighting each other. And I'm going to end our slideshow here, because that was leading up to what's next. And I have these pictures here, and I'm telling you to stay tuned, because if you look carefully at these pictures, you might recognize what these are. Because the outcome of the French and Indian War, which was that British soldiers were left behind to protect, actually ends up leading to these three famous events. This is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. This is a very famous picture of the Boston Massacre that was actually drawn by Paul Revere. And this is a picture of a painting of something called the Boston Tea Party. So you may have heard of those things, but in the next few weeks, you're going to become an expert at these things. And it is such an interesting part of our country's history, and how we went from being an English colony to being our own country. So stay tuned.